Chapter 6. When he remembered the scene afterwards, this is how Raskolnikov saw it. The noise behind the door increased, and suddenly the door was opened a little. "What is it?" cried Porfiri Petrovitch, annoyed. "I gave instructions." For an instant there was no answer, but it was evident that there were several persons at the door, and that they were apparently pushing somebody back. "What is it?" Porfiri Petrovitch repeated uneasily. "The prisoner Nikolai has been brought," someone answered. "He is not wanted. Take him away. Let him wait. What's he doing here? This is entirely out of order," cried Porfiri, rushing to the door. "But he—" began the same voice, and suddenly ceased. 2 seconds, not more, were spent in actual struggle. Then someone gave a violent shove, and then a man, very pale, strode into the room. This man's appearance was at first sight very strange. He stared straight before him, as though seeing nothing. There was a determined gleam in his eyes. At the same time there was a deathly pallor in his face, as though he were being led to the scaffold. His white lips were faintly twitching. He was dressed like a workman and was of medium height, very young, slim, with a round haircut and thin, spare features. The man whom he had thrust back followed him into the room and succeeded in seizing him by the shoulder. He was a warder. Nikolai pulled his arm away. Several people crowded inquisitively into the doorway. Some of them tried to get in. All this took place almost instantaneously. "Go away, it's too soon. Wait until you are sent for. Why have you brought him so soon?" Porfiri Petrovitch muttered, extremely annoyed, as if his plans had been upset. But Nikolai suddenly knelt down. "What's the matter?" cried Porfiri, surprised. "I am guilty. The sin is mine. I am the murderer," Nikolai articulated suddenly, rather breathless, but speaking fairly loudly. For 10 seconds there was a silence, as though everyone had been struck dumb. Even the warder stepped back, mechanically treated to the door, and stood motionless. "What is it?" cried Porfiri Petrovitch, recovering from his momentary disbelief. "I am the murderer," repeated Nikolai after a brief pause. Who did you kill?" Porfiri Petrovitch was obviously bewildered. Nikolai again was silent for a moment. "Alyona Ivanovna and her sister Lizaveta Ivanovna I killed with an axe. Darkness came over me," he added suddenly, and fell silent again. He remained on his knees. Porfiri Petrovitch stood for some moments as though meditating, but suddenly roused himself and waved back the uninvited spectators. They instantly vanished and closed the door. Then he looked towards Raskolnikov, who was standing in the corner, staring wildly at Nikolai, and moved towards him, but stopped short, looked from Nikolai to Raskolnikov, and then again at Nikolai, and seeming unable to restrain himself, darted at the latter. "You're in too great a hurry," he shouted at him, almost angrily. "I didn't ask you what came over you. Tell me, did you kill them?" "I am the murderer. I want to give evidence," Nikolai pronounced. "Ah, what did you kill them with?" "An axe. I had it ready." "He is in a hurry. Alone?" Nikolai did not understand the question. "Did you do it alone?" "Yes, alone. And Mitka is not guilty and had no share in it. Don't be in a hurry about Mitka. How was it you ran downstairs like that at the time? The porters met you both. It was to put them off the scent. I ran after Mitka, Nikolai replied hurriedly, as though he had prepared the answer. I knew it, cried Porfiry with vexation. It's not his own tale he is telling, he muttered as though to himself, and suddenly his eyes rested on Raskolnikov again. He was apparently so taken up with Nikolai that for a moment he had forgotten Raskolnikov. He was a little taken aback. "My dear Rodion Romanovitch, excuse me." He flew up to him. "This shouldn't have happened. I'm afraid you must go. It'll be no good if you stay. I will... You see, what a surprise. Goodbye." And taking him by the arm, he showed him to the door. "I suppose you didn't expect it?" said Raskolnikov, who, though he had not yet fully grasped the situation, had regained his courage. "You did not expect it either, my friend. See how your hand is trembling." "You're trembling too, Porfiry Petrovitch." "Yes, I am. I didn't expect it." They were already at the door. Porfiry was impatient for Raskolnikov to be gone. "And your little surprise, aren't you going to show it to me?" Raskolnikov said sarcastically. "Why, his teeth are chattering as he asks. You have a real scent of irony. Come on, until we meet." "I believe we can say goodbye." "That's in God's hands," muttered Porfiry, with an unnatural smile. As he walked through the office, Raskolnikov noticed that many people were looking at him. Among them he saw the 2 porters from the house, whom he had invited that night to the police station. They stood there, waiting. But he was no sooner on the stairs than he heard the voice of Porfiry Petrovitch behind him. Turning round, he saw the latter running after him, out of breath. "One word, Rodion Romanovitch. As for the rest of it, it's in God's hands. But as a matter of form, there are some questions I shall have to ask you. So we shall meet again, shan't we?" And Porfiry stood still, facing him with a smile. "Shan't we?" he added again. He seemed to want to say something more, but could not speak out. "You must forgive me, Porfiry Petrovitch, for what has just passed. I lost my temper," began Raskolnikov, who had regained his courage to such an extent that he felt irresistibly inclined to display his coolness. "Don't mention it," Porfiry replied, almost gleefully. "I myself, too. I have a wicked temper, I admit it. But we shall meet again. If it's God's will, we may see a great deal of one another." "And we'll get to know each other properly," added Raskolnikov. "Yes, know each other properly," assented Porfiry Petrovitch, and he screwed up his eyes, looking earnestly at Raskolnikov. "Now you're going to a birthday party?" "To a funeral." "Of course, the funeral. Take care of yourself and get well." "I don't know what to wish you," said Raskolnikov, who had begun to descend the stairs, but looked back again. "I would like to wish you success, but your office is a comical one." "Why comical?" Porfiry Petrovitch had turned to go, but he seemed to prick up his ears at this. "How you must have been torturing and harassing that poor Nikolai psychologically in that way of yours until he confessed. You must have been at him day and night, proving to him that he was the murderer. And now that he has confessed, you'll begin vivisecting him again. You are lying, you'll say. You are not the murderer. You can't be. It's not your own tale you are telling." You must admit it's a comical business. You noticed then that I said to Nikolai just now that it was not his own tale he was telling? How could I help noticing it? You are quick-witted. You notice everything. You've really a playful mind. And you always fasten on the comic side. They say that was the marked characteristic of Gogol among the writers. Yes, of Gogol. Yes, of Gogol. I shall look forward to meeting you. So shall I. Raskolnikov walked straight home. He was so muddled and bewildered that when he got home he sat for a quarter of an hour on the sofa, trying to collect his thoughts. He did not attempt to think about Nikolai. He was stupefied. He felt that his confession was something inexplicable, amazing, something beyond his understanding. But Nikolai's confession was an actual fact. The consequences of this fact were clear to him at once. Its falsehood could not fail to be discovered, and then they would be after him again. Until then, at least, he was free, and must do something for himself, for the danger was imminent. But how imminent? His position gradually became clear to him. Remembering sketchily the main outlines of his recent scene with Porfiry, he could not help shuddering again with horror. Of course, he did not yet know all Porfiry's aims. He could not see into all his calculations. But he had already partly shown his hand, and no one knew better than Raskolnikov how terrible Porfiry's lead had been for him. A little more, and he might have given himself away completely, circumstantially. Knowing his nervous temperament and seeing through him from the first, Porfiry, though playing a bold game, was bound to win. There's no denying that Raskolnikov had compromised himself seriously, but no facts had come to light as yet. There was nothing positive. But was he taking a true view of the position? Wasn't he mistaken? What had Porfiry been trying to get at? Had he really some surprise prepared for him? And what was it? Had he really been expecting something or not? How would they have parted if it had not been for the unexpected appearance of Nikolai? Porfiry had shown almost all his cards. Of course he had risked something in showing them. And if he had really had anything up his sleeve, Raskolnikov reflected, he would have shown that too. What was that surprise? Was it a joke? Had it meant anything? Could it have concealed anything like a fact, a piece of positive evidence? His yesterday's visitor? What had become of him? Where was he today? If Porfiry really had any evidence, it must be connected with him. He sat on the sofa with his elbows on his knees and his face hidden in his hands. He was still shivering nervously. At last he got up, took his cap, thought a minute, and went to the door. He had a sort of presentiment that for today at least he might consider himself out of danger. He had a sudden sense almost of joy. He wanted to hurry to Katerina Ivanovna's. He would be too late for the funeral, of course, but he would be in time for the memorial dinner, and there at once he would see Sonia. He stood still, thought a moment, and a suffering smile came for a moment onto his lips. Today, he repeated to himself. Yes, today, so it must be. But as he was about to open the door, it began opening of itself. He started and moved back. The door opened gently and slowly, and suddenly a figure appeared. Yesterday's visitor from under the ground. The man stood in the doorway, looked at Raskolnikov without speaking, and took a step forward into the room. He was exactly the same as yesterday, the same figure, the same dress, but there was a great change in his face. He looked dejected and sighed deeply. If he had only put his hand up to his cheek and leaned his head on one side, he would have looked exactly like a peasant woman. "What do you want?" asked Raskolnikov, numb with terror. The man was still silent, but suddenly he bowed down almost to the ground, touching it with his finger. "What is it?" cried Raskolnikov. "I have sinned," the man articulated softly. "I have had evil thoughts." They looked at one another. "I was worried. When you came, maybe you were drunk, and told the porters to go to the police station and asked about the blood. I was worried that they let you go and thought you were drunk. I was so worried I lost my sleep. And remembering the address, we came here yesterday and asked for you." "Who came?" Raskolnikov interrupted, instantly beginning to remember. "I did. I've wronged you." "Then you came from that house?" "I was standing at the gate with them. Don't you remember? We have carried on our trade in that house for many years. We cure and prepare hides. We take work home. Most of all, I was worried." And the whole scene of the day before yesterday in the gateway came clearly into Raskolnikov's mind. He recalled that there had been several people there besides the porters, women among them. He remembered one voice had suggested taking him straight to the police station. He could not recall the face of the speaker, and even now he did not recognize it. But he remembered that he had turned round and made him some answer. So this was the solution of yesterday's horror. The most awful thought was that he had been actually almost lost, had almost done for himself on account of such a trivial circumstance. So this man could tell nothing except the fact that he had asked about the apartment and the blood-stains. So Porfiry, too, had nothing but that delirium, no facts but this psychology which cuts both ways, nothing positive. So if no more facts come to light, and they must not, then what can they do to him? How can they convict him, even if they arrest him? And Porfiry, then, had only just heard about the apartment, and had not known about it before. "Was it you who told Porfiry that I'd been there?" he cried, struck by a sudden idea. "What Porfiry?" "The head of the detective department." "Yes, the porters did not go there, but I went." "Today?" "I got there 2 minutes before you. And I heard it all, how he worried you." "Where? What? When?" "In the next room. I was sitting there all the time." "What? So you were the surprise? But how could that happen? It's unbelievable." "I saw that the porters did not want to do what I said," began the man. "Because it's too late, they said, and maybe he'll be angry that we didn't come at the time. I was anxious and I lost sleep over it, so I began making inquiries. And when I found out yesterday where to go, I went there today. The first time I went, he wasn't there. When I came an hour later, he couldn't see me. So I went a third time, and they showed me in. I told him everything, just as it happened, and he started skipping around the room and punching himself on the chest. 'Why did you horrors not tell me? If I'd known about it, I should have arrested him.' Then he ran out, called somebody, and began talking to him in the corner. Then he turned to me, reprimanding and questioning me. He criticized me a great deal, and I told him everything, and I told him that you didn't dare to say a word in answer to me yesterday, and that you didn't recognize me. And he started running around again and kept on hitting himself on the chest, and getting angry and running around, and when they announced that you were here, he told me to go into the next room. "Sit there for a bit," he said. "Don't move whatever you hear." And he put a chair there for me and locked me in. "I may call you," he said, "perhaps." And when Nikolai had been brought, he let me out as soon as you were gone. "I'll send for you and question you again," he said.
And did he question Nikolai while you were there?
He got rid of me like he got rid of you before he spoke to Nikolai.
The man stood still, and again suddenly bowed down, touching the ground with his finger.
"Forgive me for my evil thoughts and my slander."
"May God forgive you,"
answered Raskolnikov.
And as he said this, the man bowed down again, but not to the ground, turned slowly and went out of the room. "It all cuts both ways, now it all cuts both ways," repeated Raskolnikov, and he went out more confident than ever. "Now we'll make a fight of it," he said with a malicious smile as he went down the stairs. His malice was aimed at himself. With shame and contempt he recalled his cowardice. Breaking in. So we now have the resolution of the mystery of the previous day's accusatory phantom. In fact, though, pretty suggestive clues had already been presented in Part 3, Chapter 6, as to the man's identity. His physical description in that chapter matched the description of the worker on the street outside the pawnbroker's house in Part 2, Chapter 6. That is, the man who wanted to take him to the police station. Of course, his appearance the following day would hardly be surprising, since Raskolnikov, in his agitated state of mind, announced his name and address to the assembled crowd there. The gesture the man makes twice in his discussion with Raskolnikov is of interest, and perhaps others can clarify its significance. My understanding is that in the Orthodox Church, touching the ground with one's finger is sometimes done when meeting a clergyman, and sometimes it is a sign of deep repentance. Although the two characters are inside, the text refers to touching the ground rather than the floor, as though the workman thinks he has sinned against the earth. At this point, we can reconstruct the state of play from Porfiry's perspective. That he suspects Raskolnikov was already obvious from their first encounter the prior day. At the time, apparently he knew nothing of Raskolnikov's evening escapade at the pawnbroker's house in Part 2. And had he known, he would have arrested Raskolnikov straight away. Later, he had an afternoon conversation with an angrily protective Razumikin, and quietly formed the judgment that Raskolnikov's association was unhealthy for his virtuous friend. The following morning, he finally received the revelation from the worker about Raskolnikov's return visit to the scene of the crime, a few minutes before his scheduled appointment with the suspect himself. He apparently managed to bark out a few instructions to his staff, including perhaps to round up the porters from the pawnbroker's address, and dashed away his prized witness in the back room to be brought out as his little surprise when the time was right. Curiously, though, his little surprise would not have demonstrated anything further than what he had already let out during his conversation with Raskolnikov. During that interview in the prior chapter, he asserted that he knew all about his return trip to the house. The little surprise, then, would not have added any new facts to the case. Its purpose seems to have been to unsettle Raskolnikov to such a state that he would reveal everything. The ploy very nearly succeeded. In fact, his tactics in the interview seem ingenious. Raskolnikov is not wrong when he says that Porfiry is always lying. In that passage he is deeply unreliable, interjecting little falsehoods into the discourse, changing his tone swiftly from sneering insinuation to apparently friendly concern and back again, keeping Raskolnikov guessing and always using his own words against him. One clever instance being his suggestion that he, Porfiry, and not Raskolnikov, is the one playing the role of Napoleon. Nikolai's sudden appearance and decision to confess remains a mystery at this point. It will be remembered that Nikolai was the painter at the house of the murders who was apprehended, since he was caught drinking away the proceeds from jewelry from the pawnbroker's flat. Earlier he had protested his innocence before the authorities. So why the sudden confession to a crime he did not commit? We know already that he is a bit psychologically unstable, as he was originally apprehended just as he was about to attempt suicide. But there may be just a bit more to say on this score later. This is the end of Part 4. As things currently stand, the Raskolnikov household, recently revived with knowledge of an inheritance from Marfa Petrovna, has nevertheless ruptured, with our protagonist ceding leadership of the family to Razumikin. The Marmeladov family awaits a funeral lunch while still hovering over the abyss of poverty. A bitter Luzhin is plotting vengeance against Raskolnikov, while still irrationally clutching to his hope to restore his plans to marry Dunya. Svidrigailov has his own mysterious designs on Dunya, while caught up in personal demons that he has not disclosed. Sonia hopes somehow for Raskolnikov's redemption, without even knowing the depths of his sin. But Raskolnikov, as evidenced by his resolution in both chapters 4 and 6, is defiant and determined to try his strength against Porfiry Petrovich, who is closing in on his prey. End of comments.